Okay. And I am going to let our 47 attendees come on in. Okay. You
Mhm.
won't see them. Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Just watching as people come in, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Just to make sure you're in the right classroom, this is A Farewell to Arms, a conversation with four, but it turns out to be three editors today. All right. So just keeping my eye as people are coming in, and then we'll get started. Hope everybody's having a good summer so far and a good July. All right. I think everyone who was in the waiting room is in the webinar now. So I'll get started. I am so happy that you're here. This is the Hemingway Summer webinar, and I'm Suzanne Del Gizzo. I'm the editor of the Hemingway Review and the chair of the Hemingway Society Media Committee. And the first person I'm going to throw it to is Carl Eby, the Hemingway Society president. Welcome, Carl.
Hey, thanks so much, Suzanne. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's a lot of fun to be able to have some content, in an off-conference year. Um, Consider that, though, a reminder. Next summer, right, in Toronto, we've got our conference coming up in July, July 20th to 25th. We're starting to get up materials on the web for that. We're going to have a call for papers soon. It's going to be a spectacular conference. The team is doing terrific work, and so please look out for that. And of course, to attend the conference, you need to be a member. We want you to be a member no matter what. The Hemingway Society has all sorts of fantastic stuff going on, including, the Hemingway Review and the Hemingway newsletter and our podcast and our web content and our calls for papers and everything, and these webinars. And so, if you're not a member of the Hemingway Society, please consider joining. And if you are a member, be sure to renew too. All right. And with that said, let me turn it back over to Suzanne,
Yeah.
and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Also, just on the membership front, go into the society site and check your membership. Make sure it's up to date because sometimes you miss those emails that we send around the renewal period. So thanks. All right. So the rules of the webinar road are, this is a webinar, so you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. So the way for you to communicate with us, and you can do this at any time, is to throw a question into the Q&A. So that's where you can make your voice heard, make comments, ask questions, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout. And although we'll probably go to most of the questions towards the end, if there's something that's particularly relevant, we'll pluck it right out. So feel free to keep populating the Q&A. Also, your faces aren't here, but I just want to let you know that we are recording this webinar because we post it on the Hemingway Society website and the YouTube channel. And that's for the folks who wish they could be here, but oh, they're on the beach because it's July. So for our friends on vacation, this will be posted for you later. So without any further ado, let's get our conversation with what turned out to be three editors of A Farewell to Arms started. I'll begin by introducing our guests. So, Marc teaches American literature at the University of Evansville in Indiana. He has just edited an edition of A Farewell to Arms as part of the Norton Library series. Marc is co creator of the popular program, which many of us love, One True Podcast, which has been exploring Hemingway's life and work and world since 2019. The one person who couldn't be with us here today, I just want to give him a nod, is Marc Dudley. Unfortunately, Marc is under the weather. So, Marc, thinking of you, Marc is a professor of English and Africana Studies at North Carolina State University, and we miss him here today. Um, Robert Trogdon, who is here, is professor of English at Kent State University and editor of the Library of America's Ernest Hemingway series. He also serves as an editorial advisor on the editorial advisory board of the Hemingway Letters Project and is author of The Lousy Racket: Hemingway, Scribners, and the Business of Literature. Last but certainly not least, we are joined by Amanda Vale, who is a biographer, journalist, and screenwriter who has previously written about Hemingway in her biography of Gerald and Sarah Murphy, Everybody Was So Young, and in her study of six journalists in the Spanish Civil War, Hotel Florida. Her latest book, which never mentions Hemingway, is Pride and Pleasure: The Schuyler Sisters in the Age of Revolution, which will be published this October. And by the way, today is, I think, the anniversary, if we call it that, of the wounding of Hamilton by
A
Aaron Burr.
jewel, a jewel. This is jewel day.
Yeah.
I I
So,
should be like in back or something. That's actually too
so yeah, so just a weird coincidence that that
Thanks.
should be the case.
Shout out.
All right, so let's get going. I'll start with a sort of just a simple basic question to help orient our audience members. For each of you, what was the assignment from the press that you worked with? And I also, just in case you have a copy of your book handy, feel free to hold it up and show us what it looks like too. Yeah, I'll throw to Amanda first then. Amanda.
There it is. There it is.
And what was your assignment from your
That
press?
art there. This, as you notice, this seems to be the art that crops up on lots of farewell to arms because I think it's on the Norton Critical other Mark's book. But anyway, my assignment was merely to write an introduction because um Vintage Classics, which was publishing this book, was going to use and indeed did use the Everyman Library text, which they already had, I mean, as part of their corporate property. And that in turn was set from the Jonathan Cape edition in England, which was published in 1929, from sheets that were sent, I believe, by Scribner. So it's kind of identical with the original Scribner edition. They just thought, okay, here it is. It does, however, Robert, it perpetuates the errors that you have corrected in your masterful Library of America version, which I have combed through with interest. So I had it easy. I just had to find something to say about this book, which I wasn't always sure I could do until I reread it. And then I found something about which we will speak later.
Robert, since you got a shout out there, why don't we take it to you next?
Okay. As noted, the I am the editor of the Library of America series. This is the second volume, and in addition to A Farewell to Arms, it also includes Men Without Women and Death in the Afternoon, which I'm very proud of. But my task was to produce what we call sort of a corrected edition. It is by no means what I would call like a true critical edition, but to correct the errors that were introduced by Scribners, by their editors, by the compositors. But eventually, also, I discovered in the course of working on this, introduced by Pauline and Sonny Hemingway when they typed the manuscript, that they made a lot of errors in that as well. And the this actually occurred to me. I was at the Kennedy Library working with the manuscript and typescript, and Mark actually, while I'm in there trying to figure out why there are no dirty words actually in the manuscript, they have been blotted out by a different color of ink. And Mark was good enough to send me Mike Reynolds' Words Wounded and Missing in Action, where he talks about the things that are different in the manuscript in the first edition. And so that was how I was sort of able to restore a lot of the errors that were introduced in the TypeScript. And then there's like any number of other things like lines dropped by compositors between the serial and the first edition, or lines that were just dropped altogether into the thing. I've always said that I wanted my edition to not be able to be taught in high schools or in Baptist Bible colleges, and I think I've achieved that.
Good job.
My edition, which you can see here, and Robert, thank you for wearing a shirt that celebrates my edition. Very kind of you. It's jaundicey yellow. I appreciate it. Norton Library is a series which is a beautiful series that is specializing in inexpensive books for students and new readers. And my charge was really to write an introduction and to give annotations. And so the annotations, which total about 400, are meant to be unobtrusive, where they just they don't need to dominate your reading, but they're in the back if you need them. And so a lot of times, and I wonder if all of you agree with me, the first several times I've read A Farewell to Arms, and there was a place name, I said, oh, that's probably a town in Italy. Or you come across a person, historical person, oh, that's probably a military figure in Italy. So to actually challenge myself to sit down and parse out all of the references, it was, first of all, I learned not just a lot about A Farewell to Arms and Hemingway, but also about what it really means to extract all of the information and allusions from a novel. So it was really humbling and a little embarrassing to know that I had been teaching this novel basically with a surface understanding of it and how much Hemingway packs into it. So I really celebrated the opportunity. I was going to start by saying, Norton asked me to edit this edition, but it's really that's really a euphemism that means I asked Norton if they would let me do it. And so I really appreciate Norton's allowance.
Norton said yes, huh?
After a few times, they did, yes.
Okay. All right. So, I guess that's a nice segue into the next question, which is, what did you learn about the text of the first edition of A Farewell to Arms through your work? So, Mark, maybe you should start with this one. Thanks.
So what I would love to hear Robert talk about is, and this, so what I try to do, and there's many different ways to land on what text you're going to use and what your guiding policy is going to be. I tried to be as close to the first edition as possible, with all of its idiosyncrasies and all of its errors. I just wanted to do as honest a job replicating that, correcting the Scribner's paperback, with a mind of not just the punctuation, but also the spacing, which is very important in A Farewell to Arms, which we could talk about. But Robert introduced one really fascinating sequential correction that I did amend for my edition. And Robert, is this putting you in your wheelhouse if you talk a little bit about that change? Is it the start of chapter 14? Am I right about that?
It's the start of chapter 12, and
12.
if anybody has worked with the manuscript, it's a messy manuscript. There is a ton of revisions in the manuscript itself, and it's the second and third paragraphs in chapter 12 are transposed in the manuscript. They're in a different order, and it's one of the paragraphs exists on only one manuscript page. I mean, I think both of them do, but there's a ton of revisions, but they're numbered, and it's clear enough what order they go in. But I think it just, in the series of typing, either Sonny or Pauline, they just got shuffled. And so that's that's like, besides putting in all of the dirty words, reinserting the dirty words, and reinserting some other words. That's like the biggest change that I made. Um, and my base text was the first edition, but before I began, I actually collated that edition with the 19, I think it's 47 illustrated edition, and then with I think it's the 1956 the uniform. And one of the things that Marc alluded to, spacing, the line spaces between passages becomes very important, and a lot of them have been lost over time. And starting with the illustrated and carried on. And so I think Marc's edition and Amanda's, haven't seen either of your editions. I'm very sorry. But there's a line space between the in the Stresa section about, like, the importance of the night, and everyone breaks, and the world breaks everyone. And that paragraph is set off by itself. It's not, in the main body of the edition of the chapter. So, using the first edition, you were able to get that back in some of the others. But there's a lot of other changes between, subsequent compositors introduced tense changes, but they changed verbs for some, unknown reason, and things of that nature. So you're always better going back to the first edition than, like, just put it, something published in the 50s or reprinted in the 50s.
Yeah.
Well, that said, I was not in a hurry to restore the expletives as Robert was. I wanted to reproduce the effect of reading it with all of the tension of those hyphens, of those dashes, the 16 dashes. But I did enjoy annotating them and getting to write out the words myself.
As long as they exist somewhere in the book.
It strikes me that from a teaching point of view, and this is getting ahead of ourselves here, though, that, and I'm not a teacher, but if I were teaching this novel, it would be interesting to be able to say, well, so, you didn't use these words. They were not publishable. And I think for young people who, every second word is something that our grandparents would just faint dead away if they heard. It's a real adjustment to understand how people framed things in another era. So,
Yeah.
I fell back on Hemingway's, was great admiration of Frederick Manning's The Middle Parts of Fortune, which was published privately, and with not his name in England, and part of that was because he did use the expletives for soldiers during warfare. And also his Esquire piece, Defense of Dirty Words, which is shamefully was not collected in Byline, but I think is very important to understanding, where he talks about, like, the sense of realism that he wants to get, and by using the words that soldiers actually used. And part of this is also, like, as the 1930s goes along, he is allowed greater and greater latitude in what he's able to do. The other thing about this is, like, Max Perkins was a little bit very stodgy, and where, was, very, didn't want to offend the ghost of Henry James in The Sun Also Rises, and told Fitzgerald that he didn't like the, Dick Diver's line, "I never went in for making love to dry loins, and tender as the night." And again, it's also, my market is not like the classroom.
Yeah.
So I'm, was allowed a much greater latitude by my editor than Hemingway was allowed by his.
And Robert, keep in mind, in all of our edition, I think the word that remains is the vile racial epithet that Frederick Henry uses to describe Othello, like that wasn't
Oh yeah.
censored.
That was not censored, and there was no part of the discussions about, by Perkins. That was fine.
Right.
It's, and I've been doing some work on Green Hills of Africa for the future, and I was like going, oh Lord, I forgot how racist this thing is.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'm curious about, because we've all read Farewell to Arms multiple times, I'm sure, and we've been to many conferences where we hear papers about it. But, at this point in your careers, sitting down with the text, really studying it, did that change the way you're interpreting the novel or teaching it?
Well, I can say something, and Suzanne, I'm not sure it's about interpretation, but sitting down with the novel, and I would love to hear what Amanda and Robert say about this, is the thing that I was astounded by is what Hemingway does with the less important characters, like Simmons, the silhouette cutter, the captain on the train fighting Frederick for the seat. All of these throwaway scenes, the doctors, the nurses, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you were to list the characters in importance, way down the list, people who appear just for a page or two, and how Hemingway puts tension and interest, it's sometimes humor in all of these scenes. And if you actually had to list out all the characters, all the human beings that you are individuated in A Farewell to Arms, I think it's extraordinary how he makes use of all of these episodes. I never really appreciated that until I went episode by episode like that.
Do you find that unusual for his work, or do you have a sense of why he might have been doing that?
So I think The Sun Also Rises does the same thing.
Okay.
But I'm not sure other writers are able to do that. Like, what I would look at is like, just, I could pick any of them, but like the opera singers,
Right.
Count Greffy. Why is Count Greffy such an enduring, iconic
You can see
character?
him. You can absolutely see him and hear his voice. Well, of course, Hemingway is a journalist and he pays attention to details. Is one of the things. He's also such a great short story writer. Again, because he he's a quite small lens. He comes in very close. And that is what, to me, strikes me every time when I read his work closely, is that his incredible tight focus. And it's the thing that just, it's so modern, really. It's very thrilling to read.
Yeah, the level of detail is, I mean, this another project on The Sun Also Rises that I'm working on for next year is the specific, the specific, you could use this and people have as a guidebook. I mean, it's extremely accurate for walking around the area. I feel probably the same way about Milan. I mean, he's extremely accurate on the military details about when attacks happen, where they happen, things of that nature. But one of the things that really struck me, and it's about the train scene when he's leaving Milan in the end of book 2, when he sends the porter to hold his seat and the machine gunner gets mad at him, is I came away not really liking Frederick Henry as a human being that much after, delving into this. I mean, that is a really awful, very privileged, very, move on his part to send someone in his place to hold his seat. And the other thing that strikes me is he's just a really bad soldier. I mean, he leaves the retreat, gets the ambulances stuck, loses the ambulances, and part of me thought the battle police were probably right to arrest him, if not just because he's a foreigner, but just because of his level of incompetence. at the end of book 3.
I did not think Robert was going to be rooting for the Carabinieri in A Farewell to Arms. This is big news coming from the webinar, Suzanne.
Yeah.
And really, and this is kind of part of what the book is about. He's really a jerk when
Yeah.
the book starts, and he mature. I mean, it's he grows into some kind of maturity, not all the way though.
Right.
I don't
It's Yeah, it's kind of funny because it's like when he's like getting dressed to go see Catherine and he feels like a masquerader when he's in his uniform, and then when he's like in the Simmons civilian clothes, he feels like he's a masquerader there. And when he's boxing in Switzerland, he doesn't recognize himself in the mirror with the beard. I mean, he's just like he doesn't know who he is
I
part of
would
the time.
I would give Hemingway a lot of credit, Amanda, for including scenes
Yeah,
where
yeah.
where his protagonist isn't easy to root for,
Yeah,
obnoxious,
the
right?
whole point is that he actually grow. I mean, that's what makes the book a great book, is that he, unlike Sun Also Rises, it's an easy book to love, but it doesn't exhibit the same amount of growth for
Mm.
its main characters. They get to an acceptance of some kind, but I think Frederick goes farther. I think there's more of a kind of classical arc there that he's really working on. Um, and I feel that Hemingway was really under the gun to get that, and I will get to that in a minute, maybe. Um, when we talk about, I was when I read this book, I read it. My brief was to write this introduction. And I thought, well, what can I say? I'm not a scholar. I try to read like a scholar, but I haven't spent years doing this. I don't work in that vineyard. What can I bring to this project? And I thought, well, I can bring my interest in how art comes out of people's lives. I'm a biographer. That is what I do. And it was when I did this that I began to think two things. First of all, what was Hemingway going through when he was trying to write this book? What did he want to do with it? And what did he have to overcome to do that? And here is this man who, at the time that he was writing it, he had so much pressure on him to produce a big book. Which he said to everyone that he's wrote to or talked to, I know the next book has to be a big one. And he knew that this book had to have substance and heft. And what enabled him to produce that, which I think he did, was something that I had never expected to find. I don't know if this is a time to talk about this or if we should wait until we talk about
Amanda, you have us hanging on the edge of our seats. Please do say. Well, please do say.
All right. So when I started to read this book very closely, because I thought, okay, I'm just going to read it and listen and watch. Something that's really stuck out to me was the way that Catherine's voice reminded me of someone. Who was it? And it was this kind of weird, slightly cloying, accommodating voice. And I went and looked everywhere in Hemingway's work, and bang, Hadley Hemingway, as she is presented in A Movable Feast, seemed to have that same kind of compliant, indulgent voice. And this didn't make any sense to me at first, because Farewell to Arms is usually, you think of this is a novel that Hemingway writes when he comes back to America. He's divorced from Hadley. The love story that is at the heart of it is based on, it's a kind of reworking of a failed romance that Hemingway himself had with a nurse who cared for him in Italy when he was wounded. The circumstances of Catherine's death are, sort of close to it's kind of like a counterfactual of the birth of Patrick Hemingway, Pauline's cesarean section. She didn't die, but Hemingway might have been afraid she was going to. But then when I started poking around in Hemingway's life, and in the novel itself, I started to see lots more similarities. Like Catherine and Frederick Henry kind of retrace Hadley and Hemingway's steps when they walked around Milan and in a trip that they made there with Guy Hickok. Their experiences of winters in their winter in Switzerland is very close to what Hemingway and Hadley had in the Austrian Alps. It's cold. They warm themselves with a porcelain stove. Hemingway and Frederick Henry each grow a beard. And I started thinking, there's an awful lot of stuff that's awfully similar here. But most saliently, as I discovered, the nurse, this is the kind of thing that for Hemingway, this is never an accident for Hemingway. He does this kind of thing very consciously in his work. The nurse, who was originally called Ag in the first, because her name was Agnes, was originally called Ag in an early story that Hemingway wrote about this romance. Then he renames her Luce in a later version, which is in our time. In this book, in this novel, suddenly she's called Catherine. And Cat, or Kitty, or Catherine, was a kind of code name that Hadley and Hemingway used for Hadley. She was called Cat or Kitty or Kitty Cat. Hemingway would even write in his diary, he would keep track of her menstrual cycles, and he would write, Kitty commenced in his diary. And I thought, oh, this is never, this is never insignificant in his fiction. Alfred Kazin, I think, pointed this out, and the sort of the importance of naming in Hemingway. And as I tried to figure out what that meant, I realized that maybe in the aftermath of Hemingway's breakup from Hadley and when he's about to move to the US with Pauline, and he's under the gun to produce a really substantive follow-up to Son Also Righteous. He was working on this kind of father-son picaresque, which was set in the US, but he wasn't getting any traction with it. And just before he and Pauline sailed, this is where I'm going, being the biographer detective again. Just before they sailed, he jumped to father-son picaresque, and he went back to the old love story. And in doing this, he gave the heroine Hadley's nickname, and in some weird ways, he turned her into Hadley. And he made her tall and fair instead of short and dark, which is what Agnes von Kurowski was. He gave her the voice, and kind of most strangest of all, he ended her life in Lausanne, a place that any Hemingway person knows is a place where Hadley confessed to Hemingway that she'd lost all of the early drafts of his work that she'd been bringing to him in Switzerland, something that he never forgave her for. It was like this big unexploded bomb in their marriage. And I found myself wondering if, in a way, wasn't Hemingway trying to put everything in the life that he'd had in Paris behind him at that moment we don't want to say ritual murder, but what he was doing was saying, I'm done with this. And go on
Honestly,
to.
at the risk of sounding like completely bizarre and irreverent, I'm just going to say no wonder he made Henry so unlikable then. He's really wrestling, as he often did, with his own guilt and poor behavior. Maybe Frederick's battlefield antics and incompetencies reflect his own personal incompetencies in his
I think
marriage.
one of the things I think is so extraordinary about this book is how self-revealing it is.
Mhm.
And in a way that he often does not allow himself to be. Um, and why I love it so much. I think he let all this stuff out in it.
Amanda, thank you so much for that.
That's my piece.
Yeah, so fun, so insightful, such a great sense of that resonance between Hadley's Voice and A Movable Feast. And let's talk about Catherine for a minute. Like,
Wow.
so
Yeah.
has there ever been well, many Hemingway's female characters have been scrutinized, but Catherine maybe most carefully and most consistently of all. Patrick Powell, you said cloying is the word, and indeed, for many people, it is the word. And then earlier, I think it was Robert talking about the realism of the war scenes. But what's so interesting is even though there's this hyper realism in parts of the novel, there is this completely unrealistic for many people romantic relationship that is constantly contrasted to the realistic war scenes. So I was wondering, a lot has been made of Catherine's behavior. And so after you sat with the novel the way you have, how did your impressions or thoughts about Catherine change, evolve, retrench? Where are you guys with Catherine these days?
Who wants to talk? I'll talk. I mean, she presents at first. This is interesting too. She presents at first as this kind of erratic, slightly traumatized person when she's talking about her fiance that got killed and so on and so on when they first meet. And I'm wondering how much of that kind of bird in a house behavior was the kind of thing that maybe Hemingway saw in Hadley when they first met, because she had had a breakdown, which he knew about at Bryn Mawr, and had actually been suicidal and all of these things. I kept thinking, if I had really enough time, I would go back and look at all of the correspondence that they'd had, but I really feel there might have been something there. But then, even though she's so subservient to Frederick and is, oh, whatever you think, darling, blah, blah, blah. And she never calls him anything except darling throughout the whole book, almost. She actually is such a strong character. She's 6 months pregnant or something, and she's rowing this boat on the Lago Maggiore. Have you ever tried to row a boat, pregnant or not, on the Lago Maggiore? I think this is extraordinary. She's a tough cookie. She tries to figure out how they're going to live. She's the one who thinks, how are we going to pay for anything? How are we going to do? There's this strength to her that I did not recognize at first or see at first, but I saw it when I reread it. I really admired that.
Suzanne, you mentioned Frederick's growth, and I think Hemingway also identifies Catherine's growth. The Catherine in book 2, where she's really, to me, the most difficult thing to get behind is that she's apologizing for emotions that she's coming by honestly. She's apologizing for being pregnant. She's apologizing for upsetting him. And again, and just to interrupt myself, this is all being filtered through a distant memory of Frederick telling this story. So this is something that Frederick is remembering and capturing. So we always have to remember it's filtered through Frederick's memory. But that's not the only Catherine that we get. And in fact, you're rooting whenever she says, hey, this hotel room makes me feel like a whore. I don't like it. But then she goes back. She goes, "Oh, I'm back now. Don't worry. I was wrong then." So she apologizes for things that you want her to really believe in. And the only thing, if I can just add one more thing, if you're trying to find a context for it, that she's saying, "Well, this guy is about to go back to war. I really don't want to complicate his life. And so maybe in a different scenario, there would have been more equal dialogue, but he's literally about to board a train to go back to the Italian front. And so she is mindful of that. And that might not make it a defining aspect of her character that she goes around apologizing for everything. This is a very extreme moment in both of their lives. So I just wanted to remind us of the context.
I I really view Catherine very differently, that she is the one in control of Frederick Henry. She is the one who is she is always like 10 steps ahead of him. So that when in book one, when there's the first thing one of the first things she asks him is, have you ever been in love? And he says no, and he's mirroring her language, because he's like picking up like the British dialect and the words. The second encounter, when he goes in and French kisses her and she slaps him, and he says, well, it's just I never talk English and you're so beautiful. And she looks at him, it's like, you don't have to talk rot. And then the third encounter, when she does the little role playing game and she says, don't you love me? Yes, I lied, which my students love. And Hemingway introduces a very important concept there. He says it was like playing bridge, where you said things instead of bidding. And he views it as a game, and she views it as a game too, but she's playing a much longer game than he is, because after the sexual encounter, she says like it's a lousy game. And you go, what game? And she goes like, you play it well enough, but you're still too young. And then all of the moments when she reveals to him that she's pregnant and she's apologizing, it strikes me now almost like a mother telling a child, yes, I'm going to have a baby, but don't worry, I still love you too. And then when he says, like, you always feel trapped biologically, it kind of slaps him down a bit. The encounter in the no-tell motel, as I like to call it, before he goes back to the front, when she says like she never felt like a whore, which is the echo scene back to his little fantasy. One of the longest sentences in the book, with all of the clauses and everything. And he pouts. He's like, it was the best hotel I could get into. And she corrects him. And when they're in Stresa, after he's like run away from the Italian army, rightly, by the way, and deserting is a good thing. How long is he going to just lay around Stresa at the hotel? Because he makes no plans whatsoever for getting out of the country. And it's like everything is like, on the spur of the moment. And as I think she's the one who like thinks about these things, and he doesn't. And one of her last words in the novel is, it's a dirty trick. And it all comes back to like the games that they're playing, some of which have to do with hair, but I will not bring this up because I don't want to get Professor Evie's theories wrong.
Robert, what is she in control of, though?
Well,
I've always thought this is an interesting discussion, but is she manipulative? What is she in control of? What is her agenda?
I think I don't know exactly what her agenda is, but if you look closely at like, when does he first really admit that he loves her? It's right after the barber in the hospital room threatens to cut his throat. And after like, the porter has a great laugh about this. Frederick Henry's ho is not like, it is not amused. This is like very frightened. And then he sees Catherine and he's like, all of a sudden I loved her.
Mm-hmm.
And then after he runs off from the battle police, you get that very strange thing that he does in the train car.
Oh.
The very, very strange thing that he does in the train car, which if you think about it long enough, and you figure out it's a masturbatory action. Every time his life is threatened, he reacts sexually in some way. Um, I think, but I think she wants him all to herself. When they go to the horse racing scene in I think chapter 20, which Fitzgerald said was useless. Fitzgerald did not know what he was talking about. You notice that she very, subtly cuts him away from like all of the other people, and they go and have a drink by themselves, and they're just by themselves. And and she goes like, isn't this nicer? She's I don't know whether it's sadistic what she's doing, if it's like she's trying to create a own little world. She only lets him go to play billiards with the count after she asks for her hairbrush and brushes her hair, and he's like, I don't want to go. And she goes, you can go now. You can go, but then come back. And so just, to keep him under wraps. She's a little bit of a diabolical character. You have to read through a lot of there isn't any me anymore. There's only what you want. That's not good.
Is there a chance, though, that it's rooted in the trauma of losing her first love, do you think? Just because the diabolical Catherine, I'll go there with you, but I'm also wondering if there's not a more sympathetic reading
There,
available.
I think it's a simple. One of the things I've also thought about is like our ideas of like shell shock and like post traumatic syndrome, stress syndrome,
Mhm.
which we so often just associate with men in combat. What about that as also like just like the nurses and the VADs, what they experienced in like caring for these wounded individuals. Brett Ashley in Sun Also Rises was also a VAD. And I think like she is just as traumatized as Catherine Barkley is.
Mhm.
She also lost her fiance in a less picturesque manner than Catherine did, but I think both of them are like coping in some way with this.
And
I don't know if it's it's not healthy, but I would argue that Frederick Henry, right from the beginning of the novel, there's some unknown trauma that he experienced before his wounding.
Hmm.
That there's something going on with his family back home. It's like he says like, do you have a father? No, I have a stepfather. And then later on, don't you want to tell your family? It's like, well, we argued and it burned itself out. So I think both of them are in a way trying to create like a new happy little family. Um,
Yeah.
but not in a very healthy way, I would argue.
I think one of the things that emerges is that this is the most codependent relationship in all of American literature. Maybe Huck and Jim, but this is so at certain elements, they're both really, in fact, you say Catherine is cloying. There are moments when Frederick is cloying
Oh yeah.
too. And he's clingy, and she's like, relax, I'm just going to lunch. Uh,
Well,
uh,
the codependency, the isolation, this is
yeah.
something they are isolated. They literally are two people in a boat on a
Yeah.
lake. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what happens to them.
Well,
Yeah.
it's one of I often have taught in courses, but in this last spring, I taught it in two separate courses. Taught this novel, and in my British Lit class, taught Wuthering Heights. And I had some students in both classes, and they said, why are you teaching us novels with women named Catherine? Is there some reason? And I've said, well, there's a wonderful article by Lisa Tyler that points out the reasons for this. But it's almost like the Heathcliff Catherine sort of level of these are put up as like great romantic relationships, and then you go, Oh no. Oh no, 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 no,
What I love about this is that we mentioned Catherine, and all these years later, the chat fired up. Everybody's fired up around the question of
Ah,
Catherine. And in a weird way, that's part of what makes the novel enduring. But along that line, let me ask you, what do you think is the importance of reading A Farewell to Arms today?
no.
don't all talk at once.
I think A Farewell to Arms is more relevant in 2025 than it was in 1929.
I was going to
And
say exactly the same thing.
yeah, and Amanda, the what I would point to first among many reasons is the "I was always embarrassed" passage,
Hmm.
where Hemingway is not just talking about war, but he's talking about how we talk about war and how countries talk about war and how leaders talk about war and how A Farewell to Arms and other Hemingway works distinguishes between the dignity and commitment of a soldier and the fecklessness and manipulation of a politician or a warmonger or a jingoist. And I would think that in 2025, if we read it carefully enough, we could find relevance.
You don't have to be that careful. I think it just screams at you from every page. You said exactly what I would have said.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at uh, like the letters that he was writing in 1918 about like how jingoistic he was about the war and about the Italian army,
Yep.
and then like from 1922 up through 1929, he's seeing like the rise of Mussolini
Yep.
and the fascists. Basically, Mussolini comes to power or to erase the shame of the defeat at Caporetto and the trip he took in 1927 with Guy Hickok, um, and where he and Hickok saw for firsthand like the effects of fascism in Italy and how like these words were used, the fatherland and everything, to bring it about. There's a very strong reaction against like the propaganda of governments and politicians to use it, and that's still like one of the most moving parts of the book, and it comes right before everything falls apart.
Okay, great.
Yeah, A Farewell to Arms wasn't published in Italy, wasn't translated into
No.
Italian until 1945.
Mhm.
So after the fall of fascism, it wasn't translated. So, what better proof is there about the power of what Hemingway is talking about than that they wouldn't even let it into the country?
Yeah, excellent. All right, thanks for that, you guys. So let's get back to being readers of the text for a second. How is it, do you think, or do you have any advice based on your experiences now about how to make this book appealing to high school and college readers?
Mm.
Is there a reason it wouldn't inherently be appealing to high school or college readers, or just because it's a book that would be the problem?
The book, and also, yeah, oh, of course, because we
Oh,
know the lost art of reading these days. But also just, sometimes historical distance, I
Yeah.
think, can really uh, dampen students' interest in a book. They don't understand the context, etc. So,
I'm I'm very glad you mentioned that, Suzanne. I want to say one very quick thing, and that is, uh, you know, what percentage of new readers in high school or college know what Italy did during World War One, who they
right.
were fighting, what side they were on. So maybe that's one sentence that could place it into a historical context. That would be really helpful to new readers.
Well, that's, I guess, what I mean. The story's the story, but the novel and the breadth and significance in the novel requires a deeper understanding of the historical context that I think is not immediately available to
Mhm.
most readers. So, when you're teaching the book, do you have any recommendations about how to set somebody who's teaching this book up for success with their students in the class? Passages, historical context you would include, the way you would introduce the characters, anything.
I mean, I give like and for undergraduates, give like a very brief overview of World War One. But also it's the same thing I experience when I'm teaching a history play by Shakespeare. You don't really need the ins and outs of like the War of the Roses to appreciate like some of the history plays. Um, you don't need. I mean, it's as I'm a great admirer of Mike Reynolds and everything, and I know the dates work and things of that nature, and everything about Caporetto. But it just as relationship, and they get it pretty well. Um, and it's a lot of the times I don't bring in a lot of sort of like critical views of this, or I will set up something like when I was a young student, we had the idea of the code hero of Hemingway, and I explained what that is. And I said, does Frederick Henry match that? And most of them say, no. So it's one of the things, it's a very reader response approach, but I just kind of let my undergraduates like trust themselves on how they read it.
One other detail that students seem to respond to is just the observation that Hemingway, with A Farewell to Arms, is trying to dramatize at least two enormous traumas in his life. And there's an extent to which he has fictionalized them, but there's also an extent to which he's engaged in autobiographical recall. And that's a universal thing that readers and students can latch onto. How would you fictionalize, dramatize, universalize something traumatic that has happened to you? So, in other words, for them to realize that Hemingway takes his World War I experience and pushes it back to 1917 for dramatic purposes. It's just a remarkable artistic decision that not every novelist would have had the courage to do. They say, like, rather than take what I know and what actually happened, I'm going to combine it with imagination for thematic resonance.
And then do all the legwork, which he did, incredible research to gather information about Caporetto, which he had no knowledge of. And yet, of course, it reads as if he because he was really good at that.
He was.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so we're at an hour, and I do want to give a chance for us to peruse some of the audience questions. But before I do that, two final questions. And I think we've already heard, I think, one of these, but did you have any favorite works of criticism on A Farewell to Arms, or external sources that really illuminated the text for you? Anything that you would recommend to people in the audience?
Well, I would say the work of all my colleagues here today, including those who have not spoken, such as Carl. And I found a lot of the biographies, starting with Carlos Baker, going to James Millo, Mike Reynolds, Mary Dearborn's most recent book about him, have all been hugely valuable, even though they're not strictly speaking critical, but they give a sense of where the work is situated and how the work was produced, which is, I think, really valuable. And then, of course, there are, so many wonderful critical studies by so many people that I have not mentioned.
My edition has a recommendation for future reading, for additional research. And it's astounding how much relevant material has been written about A Farewell to Arms. Robert mentioned Michael Reynolds' Hemingway's First War, which is essential. I would add Mark Thompson's history book on the Italian front in World War I called The White War, which is beautifully written and really helpful to anybody approaching a farewell to arms. I would also add Judith Federley's appearance, her incendiary appearance on One True Podcast. She is a legendary feminist critic who detests A Farewell to Arms. So she was wonderful and brilliant and entertaining. And our friend Michael Kim Rose, who wrote with Robert W. Lewis the reading Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, the line by line explication. He came on One True Podcast to talk about Rinaldi, and he was fantastic. So those are some materials that I would lean on.
Yeah, I'm glad that the Kent State University's on like reading Hemingway series, which Marc was able series editor on that. I have very few. I would add like Sandra Spanier's article on Catherine Barkley, which I think really changed, sort of opened up the way we view Catherine Barkley as like as the heroine of the novel.
Yeah.
But I always have to go to Reynolds as well because pedigree and whatnot.
Great. Okay, now we can't finish this discussion without talking about the very famous opening passage of the book. So I know there's a sequence, One True Sentence, where we all pick our favorite sentences. One True Podcast does it, and you get to go on and talk about why that is. And I think I'm remembering correctly. So did Kirk do that as his first ever appearance or something? The very first episode, did he do it on that? I can't remember.
Kirk did in the fall. There was always the war, but we did
But I
not go
didn't
to it anymore, which is
yeah.
related. It's very
Related.
that's
But
in
this,
another country. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, but this is the very famous passage where it sort of foreshadows the entire text because it's raining and the soldiers have their capes on, but they're carrying guns and munitions, so they look 6 months gone with child is the phrase. That's a favorite passage, but I just wanted to make sure we did not mention that passage. But do you have any other favorite passages that are beyond the usual suspects, like the world breaks everyone and the words that made us embarrassed? Are there any other unusual gems in there?
My absolute favorite is in Switzerland when they moved to Lausanne to have the baby, and Catherine is talking about how she has to buy things for the baby, and and Frederick says, "Don't you know what babies need? You are a nurse." And she responds, so few of the soldiers had babies in the hospital. And Frederick Henry says, "I did." Which may be the introduction of the dad joke, but it is the first time that Frederick Henry actually, I think, tells a joke in the novel, and so that is my strange choice for favorite passage.
Thank you. Off to a good start there, Robert. Marc, Amanda?
Gorgeous.
Maybe I should have warned you guys.
What? Because there's just gems everywhere, geez, when Frederick gets caught with all the booze in his cupboard in the hospital. I mean, that's just a wonderful scene. His description of the head nurse who he hates. Oh, wonderful. I mean, there's so many wonderful things in this novel throughout it.
Can I offer a weird one?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says, I sat back in the corner with a heavy mug of dark beer and an open glazed paper package of pretzels and ate the pretzels for the salty flavor and the good way they made the beer taste and read about disaster. I find that to be such an extraordinary sentence because he waits until the very end to get to disaster.
Yep.
And he's in the corner of the bar. He's stuck in the corner of Europe, so he doesn't have to be in the arena of battle. And it's like he waits till the end of the sentence because he wants to distract himself with food and drink. And so we learn more about the way the beer tastes, the heft of the mug, and all of the irrelevant details until he finally has to acknowledge this bloodshed continues to go on. I find that it's just in a sentence that is completely stuffed in the middle of nowhere in the book. If you look at what he's doing with it, I just find it extraordinary, and nobody else would have written a sentence like that. The word pretzels appears twice in that sentence. The word disaster only appears once in the entire novel.
You know, one of the things that's interesting in this novel is that there's a contrast between cleanliness and not cleanliness, things that I felt like a whore in this hotel, that kind of thing. He has to dive into the river which is a baptism, which makes you clean. And
Porchissimo, purissimo,
yeah, and then there's a moment when he's in the Hotel Stresa. I took a good room. It was very big and light and looked out on the lake. The clouds were down over the lake, but it would be beautiful with the sunlight. I was expecting my wife, I said. There was a big double bed, a letto matrimoniale, with a satin coverlet. The hotel was very luxurious. I went down the long halls, down the wide stairs, through the rooms to the bar. I knew the barman and sat on a high stool and ate salted almonds and potato chips. The martini felt cool and clean.
Hemingway, food and drink.
Yeah, right.
He never, ever.
A lot to him. There's a whole study to be written about Hemingway and food.
Yeah.
So,
I will mention like the opening passage, which is so justly famous. That actually, there's the first draft of In Another Country, the first holograph draft has a passage that he doesn't use in that story, but it is about soldiers marching in the dust and everything, and it is almost word for word what eventually begins the opening of A Farewell to Arms. So even 1926, November 1926 is sort of like in the back of his mind.
okay. All right, so let's turn. Thank you, everyone, for that incredible discussion. Let's turn to some of the questions from the chat. A lot of these we touched on. So, especially if you have one that feels really pressing, put it back into the chat for me so I can see it more recently. But I'm going to start with this one from Bill Blazek because I've always wondered this. Does Frederick Henry ever give a convincing reason why he joined the Italian army?
No, and that's the point. Yeah, that's
That's
it.
the kind of guy he is.
It's like it's way into the novel that you even find out that he's studying architecture in Rome. And it's not like the soldier from Pittsburgh who was visiting home and because he was Italian got conscripted in. Frederick Henry's a volunteer. Almost like he has nothing better to do than join the army.
And even Italians are like, what are you doing? What were you thinking?
Mm-hmm.
He's like, I don't know. Yeah.
Do you think it speaks to something? Because we did talk a little bit about there's clearly a previous trauma in Frederick's life. So it does two things, right? Like it points to his past and it leaves something very unsaid about his past and why he's there. And it does the other thing, which is it establishes a kind of jingoistic, naive idea about what it means to go to war in the first place.
Well, it would be jingoistic if he really cared about Italy or he was really antagonistic about Germany and Austria.
It's more playful than that.
I think it's what I think it's he's of age and that's what you do.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was what went through in Hemingway's own life is that he was, there's a war going on. All right, I'm going to get involved.
He didn't outgrow that though, did he?
That's right. So like what Robert was saying earlier, he was saying like I thought we were the home team, they were the away team. Like it was so immature and so ignorant in what he actually was signing up for.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really get that with Jake Barnes either. Like, why would he's like flying on a
Yeah.
joke front like the Italian front, but there's no politics. Not like Robert Jordan. You know exactly why
Right,
Robert
right.
Jordan is trying to blow up that bridge in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Frederick Henry is like, yeah, I was in Italy. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Well, when he says, about the king, their watch, the car would come out with the king in it. Um, he himself so small that you could not see his face, but only the top of his cap and his narrow back. And if the car went especially fast, it was probably the king. He lived in Udine and he came out this way nearly every day to see how things were going, and things went very badly. It's like a little cartoon person. He means nothing to him. There is no sense that he really cares about this struggle.
Yeah.
Really? He's just there because, as you say, Mark, he has to be there.
And I think that it's very rich that he gets to talk to people like Bonello and Passini and fellow, I mean, people who have different skin in the game, the
Mhm.
Italians that are taking orders from this American. So it's interesting dynamics.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Italians don't want to be there either. Like the chapter 9, I mean, it's they're talking about like they don't want to be there either, because as the White War, the treatment of the Italian soldiers by their own
Yeah.
commander in chief was pretty horrible, and so
So one of the things now, oh, go ahead, Carl, please.
Just a little follow-up question about that, though, too. Even when you think about this sort of rush to the war, let's say in 1914, those folks who thought they'd be home by Christmas and stuff like this, that doesn't apply to Italy because that's all starting later. So he's seen the massacres, what's happening in France before he joins up. Any thoughts about that?
Well, Carl, when, for instance, in the Sono Sorority, say like a joke front, like the Italian, right? I think there might be, you might be identifying a distinction in that, like we look at it as the same war. I'm not sure they in 1914, 1915, they looked at it as the same war. I think the Italian thing was like, he's like, well, I knew I wouldn't get killed because the war didn't mean anything to me. It's like, oh, is that how that works?
what did he say? It seemed no more dangerous to me than war in movies.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. Right.
So here's an interesting juxtaposition then, right? So we're talking about a kind of immaturity or at least naivete on the part of Frederick Henry. And the novel is an example of, his growth and how he's sometimes unlikable. But on the other hand, right, this is written by Hemingway and there are autobiographical elements and we're very aware of that. But the novel is also among his most deeply philosophical and existential and thoughtful. So, how do we grapple with that narrative voice that is really exploring the fragility of humans in a cruel and random world with this immaturity? Or what is the value of putting those voices in such close proximity to each other?
Ooh.
We're
No,
just
I mean,
having fun here, guys.
no,
Existential
I think
conversation.
I think it gets back to like Huck Finn. Like you read Huckleberry, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and part of the joy of reading Huckleberry Finn for the narration is that you know more than Huck Finn knows and more than what he tells. And I think the same thing exists in A Farewell to Arms. I think it exists in The Great Gatsby. I think you really know more than Nick Carraway knows, and perhaps you know more about Nick than he knows about himself. And I think it's part of the joy is not being smarter than Frederick Henry, but having sort of like a little bit of a different point of view um than he has, and seeing that, things in a larger perspective than he sees them.
Robert, just butting in again. Um, to what degree is that then, though, through the very eyes of Frederick? in that retrospective narration.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's, I think that Hemingway creates a character and the character is not Hemingway. He shares a lot of things that Hemingway experienced. One of my favorite passages in the letters is when he's talking about Pauline giving birth to Patrick and he's writing to his parents and he goes, like, he nearly killed his mother. And then Frederick Henry like
Yeah,
says, like,
same
do you
thing.
want to hold your baby? No, he nearly killed his mother.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot, mashed up with that. But I think even retrospectively, I don't think in a way that Frederick Henry understands his story, the full implications of his story. But it's hard to talk about like what does a character know or not know?
He might know a lot more in retrospect when you take the line like the killing came suddenly and unreasonably. So that line exists on a political and military context, but it also exists in a just a human biological context. If it could occur in childbirth, just like it could occur on the banks of the Tagliamento River, it could occur anytime to any of us, anywhere. So I think what war and the crisis of Catherine's childbirth is accentuated and turned it into compressed it into a crisis. So Frederick does feel like he's able to pontificate about certain things with a little bit more insight at this point than the rest of us.
And of course, Hemingway himself wasn't above pontificating. I mean, he certainly, as time went on, loved to do that.
Well, how many Suzanne, you're saying philosophical, moments. How many philosophical moments are there in the novel? I mean, I grant there are some, but fewer than 10, maybe. Is that fair to say? Scattered around at certain moments, which might be more than you get in The Sun Also Rises.
Right.
But it's not like the whole, this isn't the Fountainhead.
Right, but maybe it is it isn't.
No.
But maybe it's just the topics and the themes, war and love,
Yep, right,
which
right.
open us up to the idea of our vulnerability, emotionally and
Mm.
physically. And so, this book has some of the more memorable lines of Hemingway's grappling with vulnerability and
Yes.
with randomness, and perhaps that's why. But anyway, we are here at 12:20. I want to thank the audience for the many wonderful questions I wasn't able to get to. I want to thank the panelists for the incredible conversation and their generosity and their time. I want to thank Carl Eby, who, by the way, if he seemed unnaturally quiet, it was because he's here as to back us up as co-host in case there was a thunderstorm or I got jostled off. It was a last minute decision. So he didn't actually have an official role. I felt a need to say that, Carl, because otherwise silence was like weird.
What are you doing here?
So I want to thank Carl for being available for that. So thanks everyone for that. And Carl, do you want to say a goodbye?
Well, yeah, again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. We're hoping to have another webinar of some sort in the fall, so stay tuned for that. And we're going to try and pair that as we did last year, I believe, or maybe the year before, with our annual membership meeting too, which is also, it's always informative and fun. And so please join us for that and for our annual Christmas party. I hope we'll be doing that again too by webinar.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful.
Suzanne.
Oh,
Thanks, Carl.
my
Yeah, and
pleasure.
thank you to the panel, of course.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you all.
everybody. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.